Pius had very few philosophical principles. One was do things and do the thing you are the best at. And that is exactly what he did himself. He was good at designing architecture, and that is what he did for the rest of his life. My name is Tyll. I'm the second youngest son of Pius Edmund Pahl.
My father had to overcome difficulties with school, and he really found his natural environment in the Bauhaus. My name is Peter Jan Pahl. I'm the eldest son.
My name is Anja Guttenberger, and this is my podcast, Bauhaus Faces. Welcome to a new episode of Bauhaus Faces. I'm Anja, your host. Today's episode of Bauhaus Faces is about the Bauhaus-educated architect Pius Pahl. After being trained as carpenter and interior designer, he decided it was time to go to the Bauhaus and become an architect. He studied with Ludwig Mies and Ludwig Hilberseimer, who would both become essential for his approach towards designing buildings. Pius Pahl is also one of the students who made the Bauhaus move from Dessau to Berlin. After successfully graduating with his Bauhaus diploma in 1933, he went on a journey to Switzerland, Italy and North Africa before starting to work in different architecture offices. In World War II then, he was drafted by the military and became a prisoner of war. Although he set up his own building office in 1946, in fear for his 4 sons to also become soldiers in a war, Pius Pahl decided it was time to emigrate. While he wasn't allowed by the French to go to the US to work with Mies van der Rohe, the choice fell on South Africa, because his wife Jeanette was born there and could speak English fluently. Pius, however, struggled during the first years as his language skills were, let's say, underwhelming. Once he and his family had relocated to Stellenbosch and he had started, once again, his own office, Pius Pahl planned several public and private houses, adapted to the possibilities and materials there. 2 of his 4 sons, Jan Peter and Tyll Pahl, invited me into their houses to talk to me about their father and his work. So, let's dive into a new episode of Bauhaus Faces and shine a light on Pius Pahl.
My father was born in Oggersheim, which is a suburb of Ludwigshafen in Germany. And my father was the youngest of 3 children. He had problems with languages at school. These problems he had throughout his life. He never learned to speak Afrikaans later on. His English was miserable. So he had to leave school without making Abitur. He then learned to become a carpenter. He was fortunate that the person who was his mentor there was a very kind person who helped him very much. And so he became to understand that even though he had been so bad at school, he was very gifted with the carpentry. That is how he came to see how things are made, not just what form they have. And that guided him throughout his life, this education he had as a carpenter. I also think that the persons who did not go through the standard education felt freer to change architecture than others who would go on the standard way. So it's not surprising that that type of person was attracted by the Bauhaus. So he finished that education, and then his father said, well, you can go to Detmold. There's an interior design school. And there my father became an interior architect. His student work is in the library of that school even today. And then he went to Karlsruhe for half a year to university. Then he felt that that was very much like the school had been. He didn't feel very well there. And so he happened to be on vacation at home when a Bauhaus exhibition was made in the water tower, the old water tower in Mannheim. They had changed that into a museum. That was around 1930. And then my grandparents, they said, well, we'll somehow make it possible for you to work there. And he went there. He earned some money by working in the office of Ludwig Hilberseimer. and Mies became his idol. My father had the design classes with Mies van der Rohe, which really was not a classroom they were doing in the atelier. And Mies gave them a task. For instance, what should freestanding houses look like and how should their surrounding be if they are designed for a city where there's no view? Then they worked on that design, and Mies went from desk to desk and asked the other students also to be in on the discussions. Then he discussed the designs, made suggestions of changes, and then they reworked it and so on. They discussed the materials with Mies, but it was not the type of German professor at all. So he was more like an office head who had concepts that he wished people to follow in their work. And my father, of course, was very much influenced by Mies's design for the pavilion in the exhibition in Barcelona, World Exhibition. By the way, I invited my father when the pavilion was rebuilt to visit it with me. He came from South Africa. We went to Barcelona together. We, of course, went through that pavilion for hours. In the end, I dared to ask my father, is there something in this design that you are not quite in agreement with? Because normally what Mies has done was sacrosanct. You could not criticize Mies. But my father said, yes, there is something. Can you estimate what it would be that I would do differently? So I told him, well, I think the roof plate is too thin. If you have feeling for structural design, you know that it's very difficult to make that thin roof. Also, as far as the proportions go, I would have made that thicker. So he said, well, you caught the one thing I would also have done different. That, of course, I discussed very frequently with my father, to what extent the Bauhaus concepts, in his view, became more or less permanent. And the one area that I think we found where the Bauhaus did not have the necessary influence was in building physics. They were not aware of the problems in building physics. And you can see that with the Bauhaus building itself. So there were shortcomings at the Bauhaus. And if you are neutral, you can find them. But that was not a favorite pastime of my father.
So that was Peter Jan Pahl talking about his father's relationship to his teacher Mies van der Rohe. Let's now hear what his younger brother Tyll has to say about it.
He was a very keen admirer of Mies van der Rohe. He didn't design like Mies, because a design is made in a certain context. The type of clients you have. If you have a state company, you design differently to designing, say, for a homeowner. Secondly, the budgets available, the personality of the designer, and last but not least, the client and the client's wife, of course. And so all of these factors, if you change them, you get a different design. And you can see that very clearly in the way Pius's architecture developed. He started off at the Bauhaus, where Mies said, don't design palaces, design a house. If you can just design a house, you're fine. Pius did not theorize. He followed Mies's dictum, draw, don't talk. And I think what he really admired was the way Mies could explain to his students why a design was good or why it was deficient and how it could be changed. And that had a very interesting impact on Pius. He was at school a less than stellar performer. But later on, as a teacher, he was a very good teacher, a poor scholar, but an excellent teacher. Isn't that amazing? Mies, to my mind, taught people how to solve architectural problems and to make the most of a situation.
Curious as I am, I also asked the brothers with whom their father was friends with at the Bauhaus. You may have noticed that this is always part of my podcast episodes. Of course, even though I mostly cut myself out from the podcast, I am always the one conducting the interviews. As a basis, I have created questions to make the episodes and lives of the Bauhauslers that we talk about sort of comparable. This is now Peter Jan Pahl talking again.
He had a very good personal friend with whom he also made his tours in Africa and in Italy. This friend died in Russia in the war. Of the other persons, he had contact with Selma Nagic. My father, somehow, he was able to go to East Berlin. And whenever my father came here to Berlin to visit us, they also met in East Berlin. Then my father had contact with, who was a painter who had also a big influence on the Ulm School of Design.
Max Bill.
Max Bill, yes. Max Bill also visited us in South Africa. When I completed my doctorate at MIT in Boston, my father came over because it had always been his dream really to emigrate to the United States. And I bought a Volkswagen bus, a used one. We cleaned out the rear, we put 2 beds into it, and then together we traveled for 6 weeks in the United States. And then I got to know many of the really special architects. And we came to meet several of the persons with whom my father had been in contact at the Bauhaus, including Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, Neutra, and some younger people who were his co-students, particularly Howard Dierstein in Chicago.
Okay, let's dive into Pius Pahl's time at the Bauhaus a little more. And I'm going to focus on his work in the building department here, although he has also produced some really interesting photographs. But that's for later in this episode. After finishing the obligatory preliminary course with Joseph Albers, like all the other Bauhaus students too, or most of them, Pius Pahl was part of a few projects. In 1930, when part of a course that the Austrian-American architect Richard Neutra gave at the Bauhaus, Pius Pahl and 2 other Bauhaus students drafted a design for the State Theatre in Charkow under the direction of Neutra. The building was supposed to be a mass theatre for 4,000 visitors. 142 entries were submitted in the competition. 68 of them came from Germany, from renowned architects like Walter Gropius and Hans Pölzig. In the end, the theatre was never built. The Bauhaus students' design shows a factory-like building composed of 6 different building structures with different heights connected to each other. In Mies van der Rohe's class, Pius Pahl was also involved with the design of smaller houses. It was Mies's belief that once you've mastered a house, you could design anything. In a series of drafts for an L-shaped house by Pius Pahl, it still seems that the student strongly orientated his designs towards his teacher Mies van der Rohe. The house itself reminds me of the Barcelona pavilion with its glass facades and heavy flat concrete roof, tubular swinging chairs in the yard and minimal furniture. If you are listening with Apple Podcasts, an image of this draft should pop up on your screen now. The idea of a new form of living in high-rise buildings was also part of the Mies classes. What was already practiced in the US at the time was a totally new concept in Germany. A lack of housing and the idea to use space not only on the ground but also on a vertical axis triggered many modern architects to experiment with that new genre. While at the Bauhaus, as Pius Pahl's sons have already mentioned, he worked in Ludwig Hilberseimer's office. I already talked about Hilberseimer briefly in the Bauhaus Faces episode about Otti Berger, who was his partner. Hilberseimer was an architect and urban planner who emigrated to the US and helped Mies van der Rohe build the IT in Chicago. He took over the Bauhaus building department from Hans Witwer in 1929, when Hannes Meyer was still director at the Bauhaus, and followed in Witwer's footsteps by developing ideas of light. When in 1930 Mies van der Rohe became director at the Bauhaus, Hilberseimer now taught the classes urban planning and housing development. He had the vision to create what he called the new city, the vision of a city suitable for humans and traffic. He thought of a combination of freestanding detached houses, L-shaped row houses, and individual houses put together in a specific pattern, and in that way creating free spaces in between for gardens and lawns. Pius Pahl worked closely together with Hilberseimer and did all the drawings for his publications. A series of drawings shows site plans, ground floor plans, and perspectives of the new city. The repeated pattern seems unreal and more like a weaving pattern than an urban housing concept, I think. If it had worked or not, however, we will never know because the project was never realized. As a student of Hilberseimer's classes, Pius Pahl was concerned with the concept of the growing house. The task was to imagine a growing family with children and then shrinking back into two persons after the children leave the house. How would you realize this task? Pahl's outset was to create relatively big basic spaces, kitchen, bathroom, living area. These basic spaces could be extended by small bedrooms. In addition, every small house had a terrace with a kitchen garden on the southern side. In 1933, Pius Pahl graduated from the Bauhaus with a diploma thesis about a house at Lake Garda in Italy. Peter Jan Pahl explains the outset of the task that Pius Pahl was given or chose himself.
The task was, there was a painter and his wife who was a sculptor. And the concept was they had a nice plot directly on the Gardasee, on the eastern side. And the plot was from the street down to the water, with a big difference of height. They had no children, and so the house was to give as good an environment for the work of these two people and the living of these two people as possible. So the entrance was at the level of the street, with the garage directly at the street. And then there was onto a terrace. And the terrace, it was L-shaped. The terrace covered all of the building. Then there is a staircase, more or less in the corner of the L, going down. And then a very big living room with glass on three sides, from which you had a panoramic view of the complete lake. I have an old film of Haus am Gardasee, which a friend of mine created on the computer for my father's 80th birthday. And my mother had that idea, and I implemented it. That film, of course, gives a very good impression of what it was like.
Peter Jan Pahl gave me a copy of the film of the house on Lake Garda. Unfortunately for me, it was a VHS cassette, and I have not even a DVD player in my house anymore. But Tyll Pahl came to the rescue and sent me a film file. This film is a CAD, a cut animation of Pius Pahl's drafts for his Bauhaus diploma. You can beautifully see how his ideas would have worked on the shore of the lake. Here, the L-shaped form and the zoning of functions in different spaces that Pius Pahl had learned in the classes at the Bauhaus become visible. On the lake, right in front of the house, there's a quarter-circular shaped boat landing stage. The film is amazing to understand Pius Pahl's architectural concept that he would also use later on in his drafts for houses in South Africa. After his graduation, and with his Bauhaus friend Max Endelin, with whom he had also toured Italy by bike on a semester vacation, Pius Pahl worked on two competition entries. One was for a memorial in Mundenheim in 1933. It was to be purely symbolic, and thus they had free rein over the design. Endelin and Pahl planned 3 curved brick walls, 2 of them the same size and facing each other, the third one smaller and standing slightly inwards. In the middle of the circle is a memorial plaque made of marble. They won the first prize with the competition entry, but as far as I know, it has never been built or it is destroyed today. The second competition was for a church, community hall and school in Bruchsal a year later in 1934. As they had learned at the Bauhaus, they drafted a separate tract for each function and connected them to each other. The church consists of a bell tower and an elliptical house. School and communal hall are rectangular. Endelin and Pahl positioned the tracts around the courtyard that integrates the historic city wall. This competition entry has not won, and therefore has never been built too. In 1933, after Hitler and the Nazi party NSDAP had won the elections in January, times for the Bauhaus turned grim. The Bauhaus had already been driven out of Dessau by the Nazis in September of 1932. Students and masters worked hard to reopen only a month later in an old abandoned telephone factory in Berlin-Steglitz. Pius Pahl was one of the students who moved with the Bauhaus from Dessau to Berlin. He actually provided us with the few photographs of the Bauhaus in Berlin that still exist today. Let's listen to what Peter Jan Pahl has to say about the end of the Bauhaus.
Well, he experienced all of the difficult times, the controversies with the National Socialists. That was very difficult for the Bauhaus because they had moved away from Weimar due to the National Socialists. My father always tells he was given by Mies the job when the education ministry in Berlin decided what to do with the Bauhaus. They said, well, we give them a chance to show their work. So Mies told my father, look, you do that. And then my father said, the gentleman from the ministry, he came, he said, where's the exhibition? He walked through the exhibition, he didn't ask a question, he didn't look at anything. He went back home, and you know what the decision was at that time. And then my father went with Mies and those who stayed with him. They went to Berlin. And my father always told the story that the secret police came and they took Mies for an interrogation. And at the interrogation, they gave him the chance to either close the institution or he and the people working with him would be arrested. He understood there was no future for him anymore. And then my father went on, he already had made a long tour through Italy with a friend while he was still a student at the Bauhaus. And after the Bauhaus was closed in Berlin, he went on another tour through Italy, Sicily and North Africa, looking at Le Corbusier's work. And he was extremely impressed by the type of spaces which were created in the Mediterranean climate. That is something which later on influenced his architecture in South Africa very strongly.
But he borrowed a bicycle. It wasn't his own bicycle. He borrowed a bicycle and he simply rode off. And I think it's very courageous. I had the good fortune that Pius one day, while he was cleaning up his library, all of a sudden came with a notebook of his travels. And he was so pleased to find that. And I read that, and I really transcribed it. You couldn't read. As an ordinary mortal, you could not read his handwriting. But Hannelore and I tackled that job. So he went through Germany to Switzerland. He started off on a trip on a bicycle, and he crossed the Alps, of course, and he has a harrowing tale of holding on to lorries which crept up the hill, and it was fine while they were going slowly, but when they speeded up, he would also speed up once, and he would be so fast that the spokes of the wheel would start to snap. I think it was rather dangerous. Anyway,
But he didn't have an accident?
No, he survived that. He survived that, and then he proceeded all the way to, ultimately, of course, to Rome. And in Rome, something very painful happened. He had deposited his bicycle near the cathedral, St. Peter's, and when he came out, it was gone. And then he simply continued on foot. He walked all the way to Naples, took a ferry across to Palermo. Well, from Palermo on, he took a ferry boat to Tunis. And there's some delightful pictures of the boat. And in Tunis, he, of course, enjoyed the souks very much. And we have, of that time, the only critical assessments of buildings, not in drawings, but verbally. In Naples, he says, you walk through these narrow, winding streets and you look into the houses, and the sleeping rooms are practically open to the street. And then if you look a bit further, you see that the kitchen and the bathroom, the toilets, are interlinked, so the ventilation goes from the toilet into the kitchen. And there are rooms within the buildings which have no other sources of light than the dim light coming from glass panes indoors. So he was really very much taken aback by that. As far as planning, I'm sure he had an idea he wanted to go, say, south. Mm-hmm. But I suspect that he did not have a detailed trip, which then led to the fact that his parents got very much concerned. They thought he might be drifting off into a type of hobo or vagabond existence. His mother in particular was extremely attached to him. And there is a touching remark in one of his letters, and he says, "Mother, don't be so anxious. and don't cry out my name at night, but then you will not sleep well. A very touching part in there.
On his journey, Pius Pahl took many photos with his Leica camera, starting with views of cities, villages and ancient temples, to images of the people in each country, and the people he met during his trip and with whom he spent a little while on his trip. Tyll Pahl compiled the photos, postcards, letters and notes of that trip into a photo book and added maps of the route. I received one copy of it too, and it was wonderful to read it and go on that lengthy journey with Pius Pahl. By the way, Jan Peter Pahl told me the story how Pius had gotten the camera. His mother had given him money to buy a new suit because his clothes looked so ragged. It was just before he went to study at the Bauhaus in Dessau. Well, he came back with a brand new Leica camera that became his constant companion. With it, Pius Pahl became one of the students who documented the life at the Bauhaus, first in Dessau and later in Berlin. Those photos breathe the true, playful Bauhaus spirit. Students hanging over the steel balustrades of the balconies at the Praller House, smoking, laughing, photographing each other, listening to music on turntables, playing musical instruments, or simply sleeping in the sun. They're comparable to the vivacious photos of Tillich Sveininger, about whom my first episode of Bauhaus Faces was. So you might as well go back and listen to that episode too. And then there are product photos of furniture made of glass, wood or rattan fiber, and photos of the Bauhaus building in classes with Mies van der Rohe. Pius Pahl produced some of the few images of the construction work that students did on the old telephone factory that Mies van der Rohe turned into the Bauhaus in Berlin-Steglitz. Today it is long gone and there's only a plaque to remember it. In fact, as a young intern at the Bauhaus archive back in 2007, I was responsible to put inventory numbers on the new prints of these photos and create data records to digitalize them. That's how Pius Pahl became known to me, and how I got in contact with Peter Jan Pahl for the first time. But that just as a little by the way. Between his grand tour to Switzerland, Italy and Tunisia and World War II, Pius Pahl worked for different building offices. In 1934 he worked for Adolf Steger Architects Office BSA in Zurich, Switzerland. In 1934 to 36 he was employed at Paul Schäfer's office in Heiratsberge near Magdeburg, and helped plan a residential complex with civil servant residences for an insurance company in Magdeburg, today known as Schneider's Garden. In 1936 he worked for only 4 months at the Governmental Building Construction Department for the State Ministry Oldenburg, and afterwards for the Building Construction Department in Saarbrücken, and at the Architectural Office of Professor Rudolf Krüger. From 1938 until end of April 1941, Pius Pahl worked at the so-called Hermann Göring Werke, a state works company for ore mining and iron works. Here he was responsible for the architectural section for industrial construction in Ringelheim. From May 1941 until July 1946, he officially worked as chief architect for the office of Karl Lattayer and Hans Schneider in Ludwigshafen. In July 1942, though, Pius Pahl was drafted for military services.
Yes, that is a big tragedy. Here we have a person who was trained as a master carpenter, then did a degree as an interior architect, and then spent several years, 2 or 3 years, studying under the most important architects in Europe. What happened? He graduates, and then after a very short time, he is drafted into the army and spends 3, if not 4 years fighting, destroying buildings. Isn't that tragic? And then he ends up as a prisoner of war in North Italy, and this is really ironic.
Yeah, and then, of course, the war came. He became a soldier in 1942. He was a member of the Pioneers, spent 2 years in Africa, managed to get on the last plane that came out there. It was a 4-engine plane, of which only 2 engines were working. And so he was permitted to crawl into the back of the plane. They came back to Sicily, and then from there he went to Africa, and he took part in all of the Italian campaign and was taken prisoner in North Africa. Then he was in a British prisoner camp until the middle of June, I think it was, in 1946. Then he came back home. Then he started his own architectural office and he became a professor at the Bauhochschule in Mainz. And that was very interesting because all his students many of his students were older than he was. And at that time he became a member of the Union of Architects in Germany, the Bergbund exactly. He was a member of a commission that went to France to study the French system of architectural education. So he became very engaged. He had a fairly large office with about 30 persons in Mainz. But he became very concerned about the developments in Germany, the armament relationship with Russia. We were 4 brothers, 1 sister. He said, my 4 sons are not going into the army. And my mother was born in Cape Town. So they met in Magdeburg, while my father was an architect. And so my mother knew that South Africa was very beautiful. And she had been very seriously wounded in the war because the village in which we lived was bombed because the German high command was there. And she had about 30 holes in her head and suffered. Living in the Rhineland, it was very difficult. She hoped it would become better in South Africa, which it did. So in 1952, they decided to emigrate to South Africa.
Historians, of course, often face the problem of migration. And there are 2 answers why people migrate. One is political, say an extreme form of war. The second is commercial interests, poverty. Now, if you look at Pius' situation after the war, he had a large practice in Mainz. Pidian says there were about 30 people employed in his office. He was busy building an own home after 1 or 2 years already, so he was doing very well. Then something strange happened. He won a competition, the Rabote Sperre competition, which gave him a tremendous amount of money at that time of, I think it was 30,000 marks. His wish always was to move to America, to join forces with Mies van der Rohe. The French occupation government did not permit him to emigrate. Then he apparently had become so enamored of moving, yes, that he said, well, if I can't move there, I'm going to move there. And the French couldn't stop him because my mother had the South African nationality. The reason given for moving to South Africa were the following. First of all, the sun. Everybody who moves to South Africa always mentions the sun as the main attraction. And secondly, that the change of climate would be good for my mother. And thirdly, by moving, he would prevent his children from being involved in another war. But if you compare that with his first decision to go to North America, Chicago certainly is not known for brilliant sunshine. Secondly, North America at that time was in the throes of the Korean War. So this explanation of why he moved simply does not make sense. My personal belief is they had built up so much momentum that he had to do something. And if he couldn't do that, well, he would simply do that. The next question is, was that a wise move? I certainly wouldn't move with 5 children into a country which was less developed architecturally. And ultimately, he once confided to my sister that the move in South Africa brought our family as close to the brink of disaster as could be imagined. So from that point of view, he realized it was a strange decision. Pius had so many good capabilities, but taking big decisions like moving, that was less than wonderful.
Can you still remember the move?
Very much so.
Yeah?
It's very strange. There was never any formal declaration, we are now going to move. At that time, I could already read, and I loved reading, for example, Schomburg, his adventures in Africa as a hunter. And we moved, that was in July 1952, via England, via Southampton, on a ship of the Llandovery Castle line. It took about 2 or 3 weeks to get to Cape Town. And I remember that very clearly. the dolphin sleeping, Cape Town mountains slowly rising out of the sea. Our stay first in a cottage in Woods Bay, a seaside cottage, and then half a year on a farm closer to Stellenbosch, where we ultimately lived. One has to know the history of South Africa. South Africa at that time had two main factors. The one was the Afrikaans-speaking part of the population had lost control politically to the English. After all, England had occupied the Cape twice. The second time in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars. And the English replaced the Dutch-speaking part of the population as the deciding part. Secondly, the whites thereafter had this policy of apartheid, which subjected the non-white population severely and restricted them greatly. So to be a success in South Africa, it was very useful to be white and to be Afrikaans speaking. They had a very strenuous time. Mm-hmm. They had an extremely strenuous time. 5 children, with the oldest approaching university and only able to study because of their remarkable academic achievement. And by the way, friends offered to take over his tuition fees for the family. So the first years were very strenuous. But then if you look at the record, he came in 52, but half a year later, he bought a plot for a future house. And then in the period from the beginning of 53, when he established his own office, to the middle of 54, he had a list of 12 projects either built or approved and signed. That was the facts. What really annoyed him very much was the following. He had to pass an examination called professional practice. And he couldn't, neither at school nor in professional practice, could pass written exams. He was doing, well, he had 12 projects already passed, and he was at that time teaching already a studio master in Cape Town at the university, but no professional practice. Something odd happened. In the telephone directory, it was called Pius Pahl Architect. And somebody noted that and said, but this guy may not call himself architect because he hasn't passed professional practice. And that was passed on to the judiciary. They opened a case against him. And the response was very interesting. He said, well, I didn't put that in. That was the post office. And secondly, my sign is Pius Pahl Design. He didn't call himself architect. And that board, a wonderful mahogany board, he kept, even after he was then in 55 a member of the Institute of Architecture, he kept it up even after the Institute appointed him a life membership. And he kept it up even after the Institute gave him a gold medal. It is a fair assessment of his talents. Pius was extremely good at designing. If you look at Pius, he would put a piece of tracing paper on his board, and he would look at it and he start sketching. And then he would take a second piece of tracing paper and slowly lift out the design would grow. And the design of whatever was doing was not just the building itself, but the outside was designed as well. Something which Mies van der Rohe did in Haus Lange, for example. He didn't just do the house, he designed the garden as well. Very much just the approach of Pius too.
There was an English lady, Mrs. Spottiswoode. She had a farm near Stellenbosch, and she wanted to have a house which connected the inside and the outside. And she knew she could not get that from the Cape Dutch architecture at the time, because that had windows with small panes, and the house was completely closed off from the outside. You had an entrance door and a stoep in front, but you did not experience the outside at all. Somehow they came to talk about that, and my father told her about the way in which spaces in Italy start with this inner room, and then a half-lighted room, and then the room in the sun, how that is done stepwise, and how you have a big open, glass areas, if you can do it, so that you can experience this. but that you must, of course, design so that the sun doesn't become a problem. So she said, well, why don't you try and design a house like that for me on my farm? She had problems convincing her husband. The idea of having a room with one side all glass just didn't sit well with him. So my father told me, look, you've studied physics, you must know. You can show diagrams how the sun falls into that room if I make an overhang of a certain size and so on in different times of the year. So I calculated that and we made the diagrams, and these diagrams convinced the owners that they would build that house, which they did. And that, of course, was a reference where my father could take other potential clients. And the next client was Professor Trümpelmann. He was a professor for German at Stellenbosch University. And he had a site which was on a ledge, really, which was about 30 meters higher than the plain of Stellenbosch, where the river flows. And on that ledge, he had a site. But the problem with that was that site could not be reached from the ledge itself. It had to be reached from the lower plane. So no architect was willing to do it, to make out. So my father designed the house Trümpelmann, which has a garage at the level. Then it has a really staircase on the outside. And then the house itself had all glass with a panoramic vision of all of Stellenbosch. And that house, it also had an inner courtyard so that it had both the open space and an inner space where the bedrooms and so on could be oriented. And that became really the central concept of design for living houses in South Africa, in the Cape Province, particularly in the beginning, which my father introduced there. It was a complete revolution from both the Cape Dutch style, which the Afrikaans-speaking people liked, and the late colonial style, which the English-speaking people did, which was a veranda all the way around and then the house in the middle. So in a way, he revolutionized architecture, at least for dwelling houses in South Africa, by introducing concepts that he had learned during his trips in Africa and in Italy. No, his architecture was completely governed, really, by his time at the Bauhaus. He has told me about that, what the experiences were there that really were important for him. He started off with the course on materials, where they had to use different types of materials, fabrics, wood, other stone, and see what they could do with it, which was something he liked very much because he knew what to do with wood, and he changed his experience. The second thing is that he said he learned from Mies from the beginning that you had to gestalten, you had to create form. Things had beauty, they had proportion, and the question was how to create good proportions with materials that made these proportions effective when you want to build. I think the reason that my father in South Africa mainly built in wood and stone was simply that the technology there, unlike for Mies, who had the metal technology in the United States. In South Africa, there were no artisans and so on. So when my father designed in South Africa, he had to use the local materials, the local artisans, and he developed a type of building that was based on these factors. But the proportions and the types of rooms were very Bauhaus. When you can see it, you know this. I think there's one thing he emphasized more than Mies did. That is to create the houses to be suitable for the persons who were going to live in them. If he had an assignment, commission, to design a living house, he went sometimes even to live for a few days, but certainly to spend an awful amount of time with the families to know what the persons liked, how they were to each other, to what extent they wanted open and closed spaces, all the sorts of things that are important for architecture. So he tried to get to know the persons first. And then he very much tried to understand the possibilities offered by the sites. South Africa has a lot of space, but if you build in a city like Cape Town or in a village like Stellenbosch, you have restrictions from the sites. And he always tried to make best use of that. I remember one house when I worked in his office, which he designed in Chabot, which is a village very close to Stellenbosch, more to the east. The mayor of that town owned a plot which was a rock outcrop in the middle of that city. And around that city, there are orchards everywhere. And so all the architects had told that mayor, we can't do anything with that plot. So my father told me, look, we are going to put a house on that. We'll put it on columns with a concrete platform and the house on the concrete platform. You do the engineering and I do the architecture. And we did that together. That house still exists today. There was a beautiful view from the top there. Yeah? You saw the way in which the buildings fitted into the orchards and into some woods and so on. Well, that is one building that I remember well. Another I remember very well is the German school in Cape Town. The German community had a very valuable plot near the cathedral in Cape Town, which they sold to a development company because the school that was on it was just too small and was too old. Then they bought a very nice plot on the slopes of Table Mountain. And then my father was given the assignment to design the German school there. At that time, I was draftsman in his office. So I did all of the drawings for that school for him. And he went so far, he designed the desks. They were all made locally. You couldn't get anything like that. He had a central courtyard where he had auditorium in the open air and so on. You can still see that school today.
So he thought architecture and interior design together?
Yes. Well,
as a unity, so to speak?
Yes, yes. When my father designed the living house, he usually designed the kitchen, also with detailed drawings and everything, because you could not buy a kitchen off the shelf in South Africa. People just put cupboards and so on in not modern type of kitchen equipment. And so he designed modern kitchens. And of course that did not pay off at all financially. Financially, he was always just okay, but he never became rich.
Pius's architecture developed. He started off at the Bauhaus, where Mies said, don't design palaces, design a house. If you can just design a house, you're fine. Then after graduating, he really did something quite different. He went into big industrial designs. He moved on to South Africa, and there the technology was very primitive. So the houses which he designed in South Africa are steep-roofed, and they reflect the financial condition of the people and the technology and the knowledge of the workman. Immediate feedback. He couldn't design Bauhaus type of things there. He had to design according to the local climate. In 1952, we came to South Africa. It had a boom, a very strong economic development from 52 to 62. And that really marked the transition from his sloping roof houses to flat roof houses. The result of which is, of course, that you free up the interior arrangement of the rooms. You free them from supporting walls, which is the major step, in my mind, in modern architecture.
After talking about Pius Pahl's architectural projects in South Africa and his development from the Bauhaus up to this point, I wanted to know if the Pahl brothers knew which house was their father's favorite.
Let me say the house which I think was closest to his heart is the vacation house which he and my mother built at Betty's Bay. It is a house on a dune, and there's a long, about 4 kilometers long, sand beach along it. At that time, there were almost no houses. Now there is a good population, but at that time, there wasn't any. And he built a house in the form of a cube, 2 sides glass. There were beautiful mountains here, so you look to the mountains, you look to the sea. In that inner room, there was an intermediate ceiling. And on that ceiling, there was my parents' bedroom. And so they looked at the sea and they looked at the mountains. A part of the building, one side, was in brick, and it had a bathroom and a kitchen and a toilet in the lower floor. And underneath the main room, there was a boat room which we really use as table tennis room and so on. And there was a courtyard and a garage with it. It is a space where the building is almost part of the clothes you're wearing. You just have something around you and you feel part of it. And because the outside is so beautiful, well, it's the closest I know to paradise.
If I think of my father, I see him sitting behind his drawing board with an old-fashioned T-square in his left hand and a triangle on his right and drawing. He lived that motto in an extreme fashion, which ended up that my mother and the 5 children really think of South Africa is how we lived architecture with Pius in Africa. We lived not in Africa, we lived architecture in Africa.
Pius Pahl's work from the Bauhaus are today at the Bauhaus Archive in Berlin. He had arranged his estate to go there long before he died in 2003. Pius Pahl's architectural work is extensive. If you want to get a visual impression of his Bauhaus-trained eye in South Africa, you can follow the links in the show notes. On the website artifacts.co.za is a list of all of them. The buildings he designed during his studies at the Bauhaus, or was part of, you can find images and descriptions, plus a concise biography of Pius Pahl on the website of Stellenbosch Heritage. And last but not least, thank you so much for inviting me into your houses, for being so welcoming. I hope I have done justice to your father and your father's work. Although I couldn't mention all of his projects because, oh my god, there are so many houses that he planned. It's crazy. And now, there's nothing left to say but tune in to the next episode of Bauhaus Faces.